Fort Confidence, Great Bear Lake, Northwest Territories, January 1827. The thermometer that Sir John Franklin's expedition had carried from London had frozen and cracked 3 weeks earlier, but the men did not need a thermometer to know how cold it was. They knew from the sound of their own breath freezing into ice crystals that fell to the ground like snow. They knew from the way their moccasins cracked like glass after an hour outside. They knew from the fact that the whiskey in the keg had turned to a brown solid that had to be chipped out with an axe. But the worst cold was not outside. The worst cold was inside their own bodies. They were dying of thirst. The expedition had crossed the barren grounds of northern Canada the previous summer, mapping the Arctic coastline, and had been trapped by winter ice before they could reach their supply depots. They had food. They had pemmican and ship's biscuit and dried meat, but they had no water. The lakes were frozen solid. The streams were frozen to the bottom. The snow that surrounded them, 3 feet deep and stretching to every horizon, was undrinkable. A man who eats frozen snow will lower his core body temperature. A man who lowers his core body temperature will shiver. A man who shivers will burn calories. A man who burns calories will need more food. A man who eats more food will need more water. It is a death spiral, and Franklin's men were in it. Then, a Chippewayan hunter named Akaicho, who had been traveling with the expedition as a guide, showed them a method of melting snow that used almost no fuel and produced more water faster than any European technique. The men who learned the method survived. The men who did not died. This is the story of the survival method that turned snow into drinking water, and how a simple trick saved more lives in the Arctic than any other single piece of knowledge. Sir John Franklin was not a stupid man. He was a seasoned Royal Navy officer who had survived the Battle of Trafalgar and the Battle of New Orleans. He had sailed to Australia and the Mediterranean. He had commanded ships in the Arctic before, on a previous expedition that had mapped hundreds of miles of coastline. He knew cold. He knew hunger. He knew what it meant to push men past their limits. But he did not know snow. Not really. He knew that snow was cold. He knew that snow could be melted into water if you had enough fuel. He knew that eating snow directly was dangerous because it lowered body temperature and could cause gastric distress. What he did not know was that there was a right way and a wrong way to melt snow, and that the wrong way could kill you even faster than eating it raw. The wrong way, and the way that Franklin's men instinctively used, was to pack a pot full of snow and put it directly over the flame. This seems logical. You want water. Snow is frozen water. Heat melts frozen things. Put snow in pot. Put pot on fire. Wait! But here is the problem. Snow is mostly air. Freshly fallen snow is about 90% air and 10% ice crystals. When you put that snow into a pot and apply heat from below, the air trapped between the ice crystals acts as an insulator. The heat from the fire has to travel through a layer of insulating air before it reaches the ice. The ice at the bottom of the pot melts first, turning into a thin layer of water. That water sits directly on the hot metal of the pot. The water conducts heat much better than air does, so the heat transfers from the metal to the water to the ice above. But the water is only at the very bottom. The rest of the snow is still fluffy, still full of air, still insulating itself from the heat. The water at the bottom begins to boil before the snow at the top has even started to melt. The pot cracks. The water evaporates. The snow on top collapses into the empty space. The pot burns, and you are left with a blackened, cracked vessel, a handful of steam, and a deepening thirst. This is what happened to Franklin's men. They had iron kettles, brought from England at great expense. They had plenty of snow. They had driftwood and willow scrub for fuel, scarce but available. They put the snow in the kettles. They put the kettles on the fire. The kettles cracked. The water boiled away. The men watched their precious fuel turn into nothing but steam, and they remained thirsty. They tried adding more snow to the pot as the first snow melted, but adding cold snow to hot water lowered the temperature of the water, which meant they had to burn more fuel to bring it back to boiling. They were burning a day's worth of wood for a single cup of water. At that rate, they would run out of fuel long before they ran out of thirst. Akaicho, the Chippewayan hunter who had been traveling with Franklin's expedition as a guide, watched the British sailors struggle. He was a patient man. He had seen Europeans make this mistake before. He He had watched them freeze and starve while standing in the middle of plenty. He walked over to the cooking fire, took a kettle from one of the sailors, and scraped the ice and char from the bottom. He walked out into the snow, filled the kettle with a small amount of water from a melted snowbank. There was always some water at the bottom of a deep snowdrift, where the weight of the snow above had compressed it into ice and placed the kettle over the fire. The water heated. When it began to steam, Akaicho added a handful of snow. The snow melted instantly. He added another handful. That melted too. He kept adding snow, handful by handful, until the kettle was full of hot water. He had used no more fuel than it took to heat a single pot of water. The sailors stared. The method was so simple that they had not seen it. Start with water, not snow. Heat the water. Add snow gradually. The snow melts instantly into the hot water without cooling the water enough to require more fuel. The water level rises. The heat stays constant. You get a full pot of hot water for the same fuel cost as heating a half-full pot. It was not magic. It was physics. The principle is called latent heat of fusion. It is a fancy term for a simple idea. It takes energy to melt ice into water. That energy is called latent heat, and it is substantial. 1 pound of ice at 32 degrees requires 144 BTUs to melt into 1 pound of water at 32 degrees. That is the same amount of energy required to heat that same pound of water from 32 degrees to 176 degrees. Melting ice is expensive in energy terms, but once you have liquid water, adding more ice to it is cheap. The water already contains heat. The ice absorbs that heat as it melts. A pound of ice dropped into a pound of water at 140 degrees will melt and cool the water to about 50 degrees. You do not need to apply more fire. The water does the work. Akaicho had learned this method from his father, who had learned it from his father, going back generations of Chippewayan hunters who had survived in the barren lands since time out of memory. They did not call it latent heat of fusion. They did not need a name for it. They needed only the knowledge that you do not melt snow by applying fire directly to it. You melt snow by applying fire to water and then applying snow to the hot water. The fire warms the water warms the snow becomes water, the water becomes warm. It is a cycle, and the fire is only needed at the beginning. Franklin learned the lesson. He wrote about it in his journal in a passage that was later published in his account of the expedition. The method of the Chippewayan is so obvious once seen that I wonder we did not discover it ourselves. They place a small quantity of water in the kettle, and when it is heated, they add snow gradually, stirring constantly. The snow melts as fast as it is added, and the water never cools sufficiently to require additional fuel. By this method, a quart of water may be obtained from snow with no more expenditure of fuel than would be required to heat a pint. The difference between life and death in this country often turns on such small observations. The importance of this method cannot be overstated. In the Arctic, fuel is scarce. There are no trees north of the tree line. The only sources of fuel are driftwood, which is rare, and willow scrub, which burns quickly and produces little heat. Blubber from seals and walruses can be burned, but blubber is food as well as fuel, and burning it means not eating it. Every scrap of fuel is precious. Wasting fuel on melting snow is not just inefficient, it is deadly. A man who burns a day's worth of fuel to produce a single cup of water will have no fuel left to cook his food. He will eat his pemmican frozen, which requires more water to digest. He will become dehydrated. Dehydration leads to confusion, weakness, and eventually death. The chain of failure is short, and it begins with a pot full of snow. The method that Akaicho taught Franklin became standard practice among Arctic explorers. John Ray, the Scottish surgeon and explorer who learned survival techniques from the Inuit and who was famous for traveling without tents or stoves, used the snow melting method on all his expeditions. He wrote that a man who started with a cup of water and added snow gradually could produce enough drinking water for a full day using only a handful of willow twigs for fuel. He also noted that the method worked best with compacted snow, the dense wind-hardened snow that the Inuit called pugak. Compacted snow contains less air than fresh powder, which means less insulating effect and faster melting. A pot of compacted snow added gradually to hot water would melt almost instantly. producing a steady supply of water without any change in the temperature of the liquid. The method also worked with ice. Ice is denser than snow and contains no air. A chunk of ice dropped into hot water will melt faster than an equal weight of snow because there is no air to insulate it. But ice has a disadvantage. It is hard to break into small pieces without a tool. The Inuit used their snow knives to chip ice into fragments small enough to fit into a kettle. The pioneers who crossed the frozen rivers of the American Midwest used axes to break river ice into manageable chunks. The principle was the same. Start with water, add ice gradually, and the water does the work. There is a second method of turning snow into drinking water that does not require any fuel at all. It is slower and it requires patience, but it works in conditions where even a handful of willow twigs is precious. The method uses a container, a cloth, and the sun. The principle is called sublimation. Ice and snow can turn directly into water vapor without first melting into liquid water. This happens when the air is very dry and the sun is bright. Even if the air temperature is below freezing, the water vapor then condenses on a cold surface, turning back into liquid water. The Inuit used this method to collect drinking water on the sea ice. They would dig a hole in the snow, line it with a waterproof sealskin, and cover the hole with a piece of clear ice or a thin sheet of translucent leather. The sun would warm the inside of the hole. The snow on the bottom would sublimate into water vapor. The water vapor would rise, hit the cold underside of the ice cover, and condense into droplets. The droplets would run down the sides of the hole and collect in the sealskin liner. After a few hours, the liner would contain a small amount of pure, drinkable water. The method produced only a cup or two per day, but a cup of water could keep a man alive when no other water was available. The third method is the simplest of all. Do not melt the snow at all. Eat it raw, but in a specific way that minimizes the risk of lowering body temperature. The Inuit knew that eating snow directly was dangerous, but they also knew that it could be done safely if the snow was compressed into a small ball and held in the mouth until it melted. The heat of the mouth melts the snow gradually. The water drips down the throat. The cold never reaches the stomach because the melting happens in the mouth, where the body's most concentrated blood supply can warm it. A man who holds a snowball in his mouth for a minute will swallow water that is close to body temperature. A man who swallows a mouthful of loose snow will lower his core temperature by several degrees. The difference is in the surface area. Loose snow has a huge surface area relative to its volume. It melts instantly on the tongue, yes, but it also cools the tongue, the throat, and the stomach all at once. A compressed snowball has much less surface area. It melts slowly, giving the blood in the mouth time to warm the water before it is swallowed. Franklin's expedition survived the winter of 1827. They lost 11 men, not to thirst, but to starvation and exposure. The men who died were the men who had not learned the Chippewayan methods. They had refused to eat raw meat, believing it was unhealthy. They had refused to sleep in snow houses, believing they were dangerous. They had refused to learn from a Kaicho, believing that a savage had nothing to teach a British naval officer. They died with frozen water in their canteens and unfrozen pride in their hearts. The men who survived were the men who watched, listened, and learned. They learned to melt snow the Chippewayan way. They learned to eat raw caribou meat, which contained enough water to keep them hydrated. They learned to drink the blood of freshly killed animals, which was warm and rich and full of nutrients. They learned that the Arctic was not a place where you imposed your will. It was a place where you adapted or you died. The method that Kaicho taught Franklin has been rediscovered many times by many people in many cold places. Arctic explorers, Antarctic scientists, mountain climbers, winter campers, backcountry skiers. Every generation, someone puts a pot full of snow on a stove, watches it sit there doing nothing, and wonders why it takes so long. Then someone older and wiser shows them the trick. Start with water. Add snow gradually. The snow melts instantly. The pot does not crack. The water does not boil away. You get a full pot of hot water for almost no fuel. The person who learns the trick feels foolish for not having thought of it themselves. The person who teaches the trick feels a quiet satisfaction, the same satisfaction that a Kaicho must have felt when he watched Franklin's sailors drink their first cup of hot water in a week. The physics of melting snow is not complicated, but the consequences of getting it wrong can be fatal. Every year, winter campers and survivalists make the same mistake that Franklin's men made. They pack a pot full of snow, put it on the stove, and wait. The pot scorches. The snow burns. The water never comes. They waste fuel. They waste time. They become dehydrated. Some of them die. It is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of knowledge. The knowledge is simple. Start with water. Add snow gradually. The water does the work. The fire only starts it. Franklin never forgot the lesson. On his later expeditions, he made sure that every man under his command knew the method. He wrote it into his field manuals. He demonstrated it at every camp. He told the story of Akayacho, the Chippewayan hunter who had saved his life with a pot and a handful of water. He gave Akayacho credit in his published journals, which was unusual for a British officer in the 19th century. Franklin was not a perfect man. He made mistakes. He underestimated the cold. He overestimated his men. He led an expedition into the Arctic in 1845 that vanished without a trace. All 129 men dead, their ships crushed by ice, their bodies scattered across the frozen landscape. But he never forgot the snow. He never forgot that a cup of water and a handful of snow could mean the difference between life and death. The men who died with him in 1845 died for many reasons. They died because they were trapped. They died because they were lost. They died because the lead poisoning from their canned food may have driven them mad. But they did not die because they did not know how to melt snow. Franklin made sure of that. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to melt snow for drinking water? What's the coldest temperature you've ever camped in? Where are you watching from, and what survival trick did you learn from someone older and wiser? Hit that subscribe button for one Arctic survival technique every week. And hit the like button if this story changed how you think about the snow outside your window. Because sometimes the difference between life and death is not a bigger fire or a better stove. It is knowing that the water you need is already there, hiding in the cold, waiting for you to ask it the right way.